The old Steinway grand piano gleamed under the soft evening lights of Westbrook Music Academy. Dust particles danced in the air as Grace swept her cleaning cloth across its polished surface. The practice rooms were empty now, the students and teachers long gone for the day. This was her favorite time, when the prestigious halls belonged to her alone. Grace had worked as a cleaning lady at the academy for nearly 5 years. At 38, she moved through the world quietly, her brown hair always neatly tied back, her uniform always pressed despite its age. Most days, she was practically invisible to the people who filled these halls during daylight hours. She paused her cleaning, glancing around to make sure she was truly alone. The clock on the wall read 9:15 p.m. The security guard wouldn't make his rounds for another half hour. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching them. She could hear the music in her mind, Debussy's Clair de Lune, the piece that had captured her heart as a child. But she never allowed herself to play here. It wasn't her place. What exactly do you think you're doing? The sharp voice cut through the silence, making Grace jump back from the piano. Her cleaning rag fell to the floor as she turned to face Professor Thomas Reed, his tall figure looming in the doorway. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, bending to retrieve her cloth. "I was just cleaning the piano." Professor Reed stepped into the room, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. At 53, he was the most acclaimed piano instructor at Westbrook, with a reputation that extended far beyond the academy walls. His concerts sold out in minutes, and his students went on to perform at Carnegie Hall and Royal Albert Hall. "It didn't look like cleaning to me," he said, one eyebrow raised. "It looked like you were about to play." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "No, sir. I wouldn't. I don't. Do you even know what this instrument is worth?" He ran his hand along the piano's edge possessively. "This isn't some toy to be tinkered with." "I know, sir. It's a Steinway Model D concert grand." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Professor Reed's eyes narrowed. "Well, aren't you full of surprises? Where would a cleaning lady learn about concert grands?" Grace looked down at her worn shoes. I hear things, working here so long." He studied her for a moment, his expression somewhere between curiosity and disdain. "Finish your cleaning and move on to the next room. This piano is scheduled for tuning tomorrow before my masterclass." "Yes, sir. Right away." Grace gathered her supplies quickly, feeling his eyes on her as she worked. When she finally left the room, her hands were trembling slightly. She had almost broken her own rule: never draw attention to yourself. The next morning, Grace arrived early to polish the brass fixtures in the main concert hall. Westbrook was preparing for its annual fundraising gala, an event that brought wealthy donors and music enthusiasts together for an evening of performances and champagne. She wouldn't be working the event itself. That job went to the catering staff in their crisp black and white uniforms. But she needed to ensure everything sparkled before they arrived. As she worked, the academy came to life around her. Students hurried through the halls with instrument cases, sheet music fluttering in their hands. Faculty members discussed last-minute program changes. No one noticed Grace as she moved from task to task. Her cart of cleaning supplies the only indication of her presence. During her lunch break, she sat alone on a bench in the courtyard, unwrapping the sandwich she'd made at home. The spring air carried the sound of practice sessions through open windows, a violin etude from the East Wing, a trumpet concerto from the West, the cleaner with the hidden knowledge. Grace looked up to find Professor Reed standing nearby, coffee cup in hand. "Good afternoon, Professor," she said politely, trying to make herself smaller on the bench. To her surprise, he sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "You know, I've been teaching here for 15 years, and I don't think we've ever spoken before yesterday." Grace nodded, unsure how to respond. "You've worked here for how long?" "5 years this August," she answered, wrapping her half-eaten sandwich back in its paper. 5 years. He took a sip of his coffee. "And in those 5 years, you've learned to identify a Steinway Model D by sight." She hesitated. "I pay attention to details. It's part of my job, is it?" He studied her with those piercing eyes that had made countless students tremble during auditions. "Tell me, what else have you learned just by paying attention?" Grace looked across the courtyard, where a group of students were laughing together. The practice room on the 3rd floor, the one with the blue curtains, has the best acoustics. Professor Lin always books it for her star pupils. The vending machine by the theory classrooms gives you 2 candy bars if you press B5 and C3 at the same time. The janitor's closet on the second floor has a loose floorboard where someone hid love letters back in the 1970s. Professor Reed's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine surprise. How do you know about those letters? I found them when I was mopping. I put them back, of course. She met his eyes briefly. This place has a lot of stories if you know where to look. A moment of silence passed between them. For the first time, he seemed to really see her. Will you be at the gala tonight? He asked suddenly. No, sir. I don't work evenings, just mornings and afternoons. He nodded, standing up. Well, perhaps that's for the best. The donors can be difficult. He hesitated, then added, Have a good day, Ms. Baker, she supplied. Grace Baker. Ms. Baker. He nodded again before walking away. Grace watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest. That was the longest conversation she'd had with anyone at Westbrook in 5 years. Later that afternoon, as Grace was preparing to leave for the day, the academy director's assistant came running down the hall, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. You, she called, spotting Grace. You're on the cleaning staff, right? Yes, ma'am. One of the servers for tonight's gala just canceled. We need someone to fill in, and all the agency staff are already assigned. Can you stay and help? It's just serving drinks and appetizers, nothing complicated. Grace hesitated. Her small apartment was waiting for her, with its second-hand furniture and the ancient upright piano she'd rescued from a neighbor's trash years ago. The piano with 3 broken keys and perpetually flat middle octave. We'll pay overtime. Of course, the assistant added. I don't have the right clothes, Grace said softly. We have spare uniforms in the staff room. Please, we're desperate. 20 minutes later, Grace stood in a bathroom stall staring at herself in a borrowed server's outfit. The black pants were slightly too short, showing more of her practical shoes than was fashionable, but the white button-up shirt and black vest fit well enough. She'd redone her hair, twisting it into a neater bun than her usual work style. A knock came at the stall door. They're doing final briefing in the kitchen, called another server. Grace took a deep breath. She could do this. Just a few hours of carrying trays and smiling politely. She'd be invisible, just like always. The grand hall had transformed since morning. Crystal chandeliers bathed everything in golden light. Flowers adorned every surface, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Waitstaff circulated with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres as elegantly dressed guests mingled. Grace followed the lead of the other servers, offering drinks with a polite smile, keeping her eyes lowered. No one thanked her. No one noticed her, just as she preferred it, until she turned and nearly collided with Professor Reed. Ms. Baker, recognition flickered across his face. Good evening, Professor, she murmured, steadying her tray. Champagne? He took a glass, studying her new outfit. So you're working the gala after all. Last-minute replacement. A colleague called out to him and Professor Reed nodded in acknowledgement. Before turning away, he gave Grace an odd look, as if seeing a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew livelier. After the initial speeches and the first round of student performances, the alcohol flowed more freely, and the donors became more generous, with both their checkbooks and their, opinions. Grace was refilling her tray at the service station when she overheard Professor Reed speaking with a group of patrons near the grand piano that had been brought to the center of the hall for the occasion. What this academy needs is more raw talent, a red-faced man was saying loudly. All technique and no soul. That's the problem with music education today. I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, our students are both technically proficient and artistically expressive. Professor Reed replied smoothly. Prove it. Let's have some real music, not these rehearsed performances. Something spontaneous. The man waved his empty glass, which Grace quietly replaced with a full one. As she tried to slip away, Professor Reed's eyes landed on her. Something shifted in his expression, a dangerous gleam that made her instantly wary. Perhaps, he said, his voice carrying across the now quieter room, we should have a truly unexpected performance. Grace felt her stomach drop as he turned fully toward her. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Reed announced, I believe we have an undiscovered talent in our midst tonight. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward Grace. Her tray of champagne glasses trembled slightly in her hands. She felt her face grow hot under the sudden attention of so many wealthy, important people. "Professor Reed," she whispered. "Please don't." But the piano instructor's smile only widened as he gestured dramatically toward her. "This woman works as a cleaner here at our prestigious academy. Yet yesterday I discovered her admiring our finest Steinway with what appeared to be more than casual interest." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Grace stood frozen, her server's uniform suddenly feeling too tight around her neck. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the polished floor beneath her feet. "In fact," Professor Reed continued, moving toward the magnificent grand piano that dominated the center of the hall. She even correctly identified it as a Model D concert grand. "Quite impressive knowledge for someone who merely dusts the keys, wouldn't you agree?" More laughter now, less nervous and more amused. The red-faced donor, Mr. Blackwood, looked particularly entertained by this unexpected turn of events. "So I propose," Professor Reed said, pulling out the piano bench with a flourish, "that we invite Miss Baker to give us a demonstration. After all, Mr. Blackwood here wants something spontaneous, something with raw talent." Grace shook her head slightly, her eyes pleading. One of the other servers quickly took her tray before she could drop it. "Come now," Professor Reed urged, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who knew he controlled the room. "Don't be shy. Show us what you've learned from all those years of observation." The academy director stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Thomas, perhaps this isn't—" "Nonsense, Franklin," Professor Reed interrupted. "We're among friends here, and our generous donors deserve to be entertained, don't they?" The crowd murmured their agreement. Someone started a light applause, which quickly spread across the room. Grace felt as though she were watching the scene from outside her body. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. "I really shouldn't," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. Professor Reed's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Only Grace, who had spent years watching people without being seen, caught the flash of cruelty in his eyes. "I insist," he said, no longer smiling. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to look for employment elsewhere." A hush fell over the crowd. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Grace looked around the room at all those expectant faces, some amused, some uncomfortable, some simply curious. Her gaze fell on a young student server who looked horrified on her behalf. Slowly, Grace moved toward the piano. Her practical shoes made no sound on the plush carpet. As she passed Professor Reed, she saw the smug satisfaction on his face. He was certain she would embarrass herself, providing an amusing anecdote for these wealthy patrons to share at their next social gathering. The cleaning lady who thought she could play. The piano bench felt foreign under her. It had been so long since she'd sat before an instrument of this quality. The gleaming keys stretched before her like a road she'd once traveled, but had long ago abandoned. Perhaps something simple? Professor Reed suggested with exaggerated kindness. "Chopsticks? Or Mary Had a Little Lamb?" More laughter. Grace closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of her shame pressing down on her shoulders. Then, from somewhere deep inside, a small spark of defiance flickered to life. She thought of her tiny apartment, of the broken piano that had been her only solace for years. She thought of the early mornings and late evenings spent at the academy, listening to students practice, absorbing their music like a plant turning toward sunlight. She placed her hands on the keys, hands roughened by years of cleaning chemicals and hard work. Hands that hadn't touched a proper piano in nearly 2 decades. For a moment, she simply felt the cool ivory beneath her fingertips, reacquainting herself with the sensation. Then, without further hesitation, she began to play. Not Chopsticks. Not Mary Had a Little Lamb. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opera 9, No. 2. The first notes hung in the air like delicate crystals, perfectly formed and shimmering with light. Grace felt the familiar melody flow through her, as natural as breathing. Her fingers remembered what her mind had tried to forget, the subtle weight needed for each key, the gentle phrasing of each musical line. The room disappeared around her. There was only the music now, speaking through her hands, telling its story of longing and beauty. Halfway through the piece, Grace dared to open her eyes. The expression on Professor Reed's face nearly made her falter. His smug smile had vanished, replaced by shock and disbelief. But she couldn't stop now. The music carried her forward, each note following the next with inevitable grace. As the final chords of the nocturne faded, Grace did something she hadn't planned. Without pausing, she transitioned smoothly into Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Her hands flew across the keyboard with astonishing speed and precision. The dramatic opening gave way to the Friska, with its dizzying runs and crashing chords. Grace's body swayed with the music's wild energy. This was no longer about proving anything. She had surrendered completely to the joy of playing again. The audience stood transfixed. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the servers had stopped their duties to watch. The only sound was the magnificent piano under Grace's command, filling the grand hall with music that seemed impossible coming from the hands of a woman who spent her days scrubbing floors and dusting furniture. When the final thunderous chord resonated through the hall, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the room erupted. Applause crashed over Grace like a wave. She sat still at the piano, suddenly aware again of where she was and what had just happened. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered them to her lap. People were standing, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Mr. Blackwood, the red-faced donor, was shouting, "Brava! Brava!" while dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. In the corner, Professor Reed stood motionless, his face drained of color. The academy director rushed forward, beaming with delight and surprise. "My dear woman, that was extraordinary. Simply extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that?" Grace found her voice, though it came out small and uncertain. "I studied music a long time ago." "Studied?" "My dear, you mastered it." The director turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what an unexpected treasure we've discovered tonight." More applause followed. Someone handed Grace a glass of champagne, which she accepted with shaking hands. People began to gather around the piano, asking questions all at once. How long had she played? Where had she studied? Why was she working as a cleaner? Grace answered as simply as she could, overwhelmed by the sudden attention after years of invisibility. Across the room, she caught sight of Professor Reed slipping out through a side door, his shoulders rigid with what might have been anger or shame or both. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Grace found herself seated at a table with the director and several major donors, all eager to hear her story. She told them pieces of it, her childhood love of music, the scholarship she'd received at 18, the family tragedy that had forced her to abandon her studies. "But why didn't you return to music later?" asked a kind-faced woman wearing an impressive diamond necklace. Grace looked down at her hands, the short nails and calluses that marked them as a working woman's hands. "Life takes unexpected turns," she said simply. 1 year away became 2, then 5. The classical music world doesn't wait for people who step off the path. "But your talent," insisted Mr. Blackwood, now her most enthusiastic supporter. "Your extraordinary talent." She smiled faintly. "Talent isn't always enough." As the evening drew to a close, the academy director pulled Grace aside. "Ms. Baker, I believe we need to have a serious conversation about your future here at Westbrook." Grace tensed, preparing herself for dismissal despite the warm reception to her playing. Perhaps they would consider her presence awkward now, the cleaning lady who had stepped out of her place. "I don't want to lose my job," she said quietly. "I need the work." The director looked startled. "Lose your job? My dear woman, that's not at all what I meant. What I want to discuss is how we can better utilize your remarkable gifts. This academy exists to nurture musical talent, and clearly, we've been overlooking a great talent right under our noses." Grace stared at him, not quite comprehending the turn her life had taken in a single evening. "Go home and rest," the director told her kindly. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 10. I believe we can arrange something far more suitable for someone of your abilities." As Grace walked toward the staff room to change back into her regular clothes, she passed by Practice Room 7, Professor Reed's favorite teaching space. Through the partially opened door, she caught a glimpse of him sitting alone at the upright piano, his head in his hands. For a moment, she considered walking past. He had tried to humiliate her, after all, but something made her pause. "Professor Reed?" He looked up, his face haggard in the dim light. When he saw her, he straightened, composing his features into a mask of professional dignity. "Ms. Baker," he acknowledged stiffly. "It seems congratulations are in order." Grace stepped into the room, her borrowed server's uniform still pristine despite the eventful evening. "You didn't know," she said, not as a question, but as a simple statement. "No, he admitted after a moment. I did not know. Grace stood in the doorway of the academy director's office, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She'd spent the morning cleaning as usual, ignoring the whispers that followed her through the hallways. News had spread quickly about last night's performance. "Come in, Ms. Baker," Director Franklin called warmly. "Please have a seat." She entered cautiously, sitting on the edge of a leather chair across from his massive oak desk. The office was grand, with framed photographs of the director alongside famous musicians and certificates of achievement covering the walls. "I must say," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "I haven't seen anything quite like your performance in all my years at Westbrook. Where did you study before?" "Riverview Conservatory," she answered quietly. "I had a full scholarship. I completed 2 years before I had to leave." The director's eyebrows shot up. "Riverview? Under Madame Petrova?" Grace nodded. "She was my primary instructor." "Good heavens," he muttered, clearly impressed. "Madame Petrova rarely accepted students even in her later years. She must have seen something extraordinary in you." Grace looked down at her worn hands. "It was a long time ago." Director Franklin leaned forward. "Ms. Baker, I believe we've made a terrible mistake. Your talent doesn't belong behind a mop and bucket. It belongs on stage." "I'm not sure what you mean. I've spoken with the board this morning. We'd like to offer you a position here at Westbrook, not as part of the cleaning staff but as a special student in our adult education program." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "I can't afford tuition." "That's where our donors come in," the director smiled. "After last night, several of them have expressed interest in establishing a scholarship. Mr. Blackwood, in particular, was quite insistent." Her heart hammered in her chest. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her, people who had accepted their quiet, unremarkable lives. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Director Franklin urged. "Say you'll allow us to help nurture this remarkable gift you've kept hidden for so long." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought of her tiny apartment, the broken piano, the years spent listening outside practice room doors, absorbing music she never thought she'd play again. "What about my job?" she asked practically. "I need income. We've thought of that too. We'd like you to work part-time as a teaching assistant. Beginning students primarily. Your schedule would allow for both classes and practice time." Grace took a deep breath. "This is overwhelming." "I understand," the director said kindly. "Take the weekend to consider it." "But Ms. Baker," his expression grew serious, "talent like yours comes along rarely. Please don't let it go to waste again." As Grace left the office, her mind spinning with possibilities, she nearly collided with Professor Reed in the hallway. He stepped back quickly, his face unreadable. "Ms. Baker." "Professor?" An awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I see the director has spoken with you." She nodded, unsure what else to say. "I've been asked to oversee your training should you accept the offer," he said stiffly. Grace felt her stomach drop. Working closely with the man who had tried to humiliate her? The thought made her cringe. "I understand if that's uncomfortable for you," Professor Reed continued, surprising her. "I can recommend another instructor." "Why would you want to teach me?" she asked bluntly. "You made it quite clear what you think of people like me." Something flickered across his face, regret, perhaps, or embarrassment. "What I think," he said carefully, "is that I witnessed an extraordinary musician last night, one who deserves proper instruction and opportunities, even if that musician cleans toilets for a living." Professor Reed winced at her directness. "I behaved abominably. There's no excuse for it." Grace studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "No," she agreed, "there isn't." "Nevertheless," he continued, "I am considered one of the best instructors here, and I would very much like the chance to work with your talent." Before she could respond, a student approached with a question about an upcoming recital. Professor Reed excused himself, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. The weekend passed in a blur. Grace paced her small apartment, alternating between wild hope and crushing doubt. Could she really return to music after all these years? Was she fooling herself to think she could succeed where she had once failed? On Sunday afternoon, she sat at her old battered piano, running her fingers over the yellowed keys. 3 notes in the middle didn't work at all. The D above middle C made a strange clicking sound when pressed. Yet this humble instrument had kept her connection to music alive during the darkest times. She began to play, not Chopin or Liszt, but a simple melody her grandmother had taught her as a child. The sound was tinny, the action stiff, but the music still spoke to something deep within her soul. By Monday morning, she had made her decision. The first weeks of Grace's new life at Westbrook were the hardest. Though she now wore simple professional clothing instead of a cleaner's uniform, many students and faculty still saw her as the janitor who could play. Some were openly skeptical about her abilities, assuming her gala performance had been a fluke or a party trick. Professor Reed pushed her relentlessly during their twice-weekly private lessons. He critiqued her technique, which had grown sloppy from years of playing on a substandard instrument. He assigned challenging pieces that kept her practicing late into the night. When she struggled, his disappointment was palpable. Again, he would say, tapping his finger against the music stand. From the beginning. And this time, pay attention to the dynamics, but there were bright spots too. The beginning piano students she assisted looked at her with genuine admiration. An elderly donor invited her to tea and shared stories of watching Vladimir Horowitz perform in New York. And slowly, her fingers regained the strength and flexibility they had once possessed. 6 weeks after the gala, Director Franklin organized a small recital for faculty and donors. Grace was listed as the final performer, after 3 advanced students and a visiting musician from the City Symphony. As she waited backstage, her hands cold with nerves, Professor Reed appeared beside her. "Remember," he said quietly, "you've earned your place here. No one is doing you a favor by listening to you play." She glanced up at him, surprised by the encouragement. "It wasn't kindness that put you on that program," he continued. "It was talent. Now go show them why." When her name was announced, Grace walked onto the stage with her head high. The small auditorium held perhaps 50 people, but it felt like thousands to her racing heart. She sat at the piano, a different Steinway than the one from the gala, but just as magnificent. For her program, she'd chosen Bach's Prelude in C major, followed by a Schubert impromptu. As she played the first crystalline notes of the Bach, something wonderful happened. The anxiety melted away, replaced by pure musical expression. Each phrase flowed naturally into the next, the counterpoint clear and purposeful. When she finished both pieces, the applause was genuine and appreciative. Director Franklin beamed from the front row. Even some of the skeptical faculty members nodded with newfound respect. At the reception afterward, Grace found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Professor Reed kept his distance, but she caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. Later, as the crowd thinned, Mr. Blackwood approached with a distinguished-looking woman at his side. "Ms. Baker, wonderful performance. I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine, Dr. Winters from Riverside Symphony." Grace shook hands with the woman, who studied her with keen interest. "Mr. Blackwood tells me you have an unusual story," Dr. Winters said. "I'd love to hear more about your musical journey." Over the next hour, Grace found herself sharing details she had kept private for years. Her childhood in a small town with no access to music education, until a visiting pianist discovered her playing by ear on an old church piano. Her years of saving for lessons by doing odd jobs, the scholarship to Riverview, and then the phone call that had changed everything. "My mother's illness was sudden," she explained. "My younger siblings were still in school. There was no one else to care for them." Dr. Winters nodded sympathetically. "And you never returned to your studies?" "By the time my youngest brother finished high school, I was 29. The classical music world doesn't welcome late bloomers." "Perhaps," Dr. Winters said thoughtfully, "that's something that should change." As the evening ended, Professor Reed finally approached her. "You played well," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. The Bach was insightful. Coming from him, it was high praise. "Thank you. We still have considerable work to do on your technique," he added quickly, particularly in the left-hand passages of the Schubert. Grace almost smiled. Some things never changed. "I'll work on it." He hesitated, then said, "There's something I'd like to show you." "If you have a moment?" Curious, Grace followed him through the quiet hallways to his private studio. Unlike most faculty spaces, his room contained not one but 2 grand pianos, positioned face to face. Professor Reed unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a folder of yellowed sheet music. "I think you might find this interesting." Grace opened the folder to find handwritten scores. The notation faded but still legible. The composer's name at the top made her gasp. Is this really? Madame Petrova's unpublished compositions. Yes, Professor Reed confirmed. She was my teacher's teacher. These were passed down to me. Grace ran her fingers gently over the notes. Why are you showing me this? Professor Reed's expression softened slightly. Because you're one of the few people left who would truly understand their significance. And because... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because I believe you're the kind of pianist who could do them justice. Grace looked up at him, finally understanding. This wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement, one great musician recognizing another. May I? She asked, gesturing to the piano. Professor Reed nodded. Please. As Grace began to play the forgotten music of her former mentor, bringing it to life perhaps for the first time in decades, she felt something shift within her. The path that had seemed permanently closed was opening again, leading toward a future she had never dared to imagine. Winter settled over the city, transforming Westbrook Academy into a postcard-perfect scene, with snow dusting the old brick buildings. 3 months had passed since Grace's life had changed so dramatically. The whispers had mostly stopped. Her presence in practice rooms and classrooms no longer raised eyebrows. She had become simply another student, albeit one with an unusual history. One December afternoon, Grace sat in the Academy's library, surrounded by books on music theory. Her fingers were stiff from practicing Rachmaninoff for hours that morning. Professor Reed's standards hadn't lowered. If anything, he pushed her harder than his younger students. Mind if I join you? Grace looked up to see Lily Chen, a violin instructor who had recently started teaching at Westbrook. Unlike many faculty members, Lily had always treated Grace with casual friendliness, never seeming to care about her past as the Academy's cleaner. Please, Grace gestured to the empty chair. Lily sat down, setting a stack of sheet music on the table. I heard you practicing earlier. The Rachmaninoff is coming along beautifully. Professor Reed doesn't think so. Grace smiled ruefully. He says my interpretation lacks emotional maturity. Thomas Reed would criticize Mozart himself. Lily rolled her eyes. Don't let him get to you, Grace shrugged. He's not entirely wrong. There are depths to the piece I haven't reached yet. Lily studied her curiously. You know, for someone who supposedly lacks emotional maturity, you have remarkable self-awareness. Experience isn't the same as maturity, Grace said quietly. I've had plenty of experience. Lily hesitated, then asked the question Grace had grown accustomed to dodging. What happened back then? Why did you really leave music? Usually, Grace would offer her standard abbreviated answer. Family obligations, financial necessity, life getting in the way. But something about Lily's direct, gentle manner made her want to share more of the truth. Have you ever been to Pinewood? Small town about 3 hours west of here? Lily shook her head. I grew up there, Grace continued. My father worked at the lumber mill. My mother cleaned houses for the few wealthy families in town. We weren't poor exactly, but there wasn't much extra for things like piano lessons. She paused, remembering. There was a piano at the community center, an old upright that no one really played. The director let me practice there after school while waiting for my mother to finish work. I taught myself at first, just picking out tunes I'd heard. Self-taught? Lily's eyebrows rose. That's impressive. Not really. I just loved the sounds, Grace smiled faintly. When I was 12, a retired music teacher moved to town. Mrs. Harper, she heard me playing and offered to give me lessons for free. She was the first person who told me I had real talent. Grace stared out the library window at the falling snow, transported back to those early years, the excitement of learning proper technique, the thrill of mastering more complex pieces. By 16, I was playing Beethoven sonatas and dreaming of conservatory. Mrs. Harper helped me prepare audition tapes. We sent them everywhere, hoping for scholarships. Grace's voice softened. Riverview was the only one that offered a full ride, including housing. It felt like a miracle. Riverview is highly competitive, Lily noted. You must have been exceptional. Grace shook her head. I was raw, unpolished, but I had something they wanted, what Professor Reed calls innate musicality. You can't teach that. So you went to Riverview at 18? Yes, it was terrifying and wonderful. I'd never been in a city before. Never been surrounded by so many serious musicians. Madame Petrova took me under her wing, though she was officially retired by then. Special arrangement from the dean, the famous Russian pianist. Lily looked impressed. She rarely took students in her later years. She said I reminded her of herself as a young woman. Grace smiled at the memory. Not in technique, she was a prodigy, but in hunger. The desperate need to speak through music. Grace traced her finger along the edge of her theory book. For 2 years I lived and breathed piano. Every waking moment was focused on improvement. Madame Petrova believed I could have an international career. What changed? Grace's expression darkened. My mother had been feeling tired for months. She ignored it. We couldn't afford medical care beyond the basics. By the time she collapsed and was diagnosed with advanced lymphoma, the prognosis was limited. Lily reached out, covering Grace's hand with her own. I'm so sorry. I had 3 younger siblings still at home. The youngest was only 10. My father, Grace hesitated. He did his best, but he fell apart after the diagnosis. Started drinking. Lost his job at the mill. Someone needed to step in. So you left school? Grace nodded. I withdrew mid-semester. Madame Petrova was furious. She called it a criminal waste of talent. Offered to help financially, but it wasn't just about money. My siblings needed stability, someone to hold things together. How long did your mother live? 14 months after the diagnosis. Long enough to see my brother graduate high school. Not long enough to see my sister get married. Grace's voice remained steady, the grief long since tempered by time. And afterwards? Why didn't you return to music then? Grace gave a small, humorless laugh. By then I was 24 with no degree, working 2 jobs to support myself and help my youngest brother through community college. Madame Petrova had passed away. The dean who had arranged my scholarship had retired. The classical piano world isn't kind to late bloomers, especially women. So you just gave up? Lily sounded incredulous. Not gave up, Grace corrected gently. Adapted. I kept playing whenever I could. On church pianos. At the community college where I took night classes. Eventually I saved enough for that old upright in my apartment. She smiled wistfully. Music never left me. I just accepted it would be a private joy, not a career. Until Professor Reed called you out at the gala, Lily concluded. Until then, Grace agreed. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived for her lesson with Professor Reed to find him reading a letter. His brow furrowed. You're late, he said without looking up. I'm exactly on time, she countered, glancing at the clock on the wall. He grunted, setting the letter aside. Dr. Winters from Riverside Symphony called me this morning. Grace felt a flutter of nerves. She'd spoken with the symphony director several times since their first meeting at the recital. Oh? She's organizing a special concert series. Hidden talents or some such sentimental nonsense. Despite his dismissive words, Professor Reed seemed intrigued. She wants you to perform. Me? Grace's heart leapt. Perform with the symphony? Not with them. A solo recital under their auspices. He studied her reaction carefully. It would be significant exposure. Grace sank into a chair, overwhelmed. I'm not ready for something like that. No, you're not, Professor Reed agreed bluntly. Not yet. But you could be, with intensive work. The concert is scheduled for May. 5 months, Grace murmured. It's not enough time. For a standard repertoire, perhaps not. But Dr. Winters has a specific request. Professor Reed handed her a folder. Madame Petrova's compositions. The ones I showed you. Grace opened the folder with reverent hands. But these have never been performed publicly. Precisely why Winters wants them. A world premiere adds cachet to her concert series. A hint of disdain crept into his voice. She's always had a flair for the dramatic. But Grace barely heard him. She was already lost in the handwritten scores, seeing possibilities, hearing melodies in her mind. I would need to practice even more, she said softly. Hours every day. Yes. And I'd need your guidance on interpretation. No one alive knows Madame Petrova's style better than you. Professor Reed's expression softened fractionally. That is true. Grace looked up from the music, meeting his gaze directly. Do you think I should do it? For once, he didn't offer an immediate criticism or qualification. Yes, he said simply. I do. The next weeks passed in a blur of intense preparation. Grace reduced her teaching assistant hours to the minimum required by her scholarship. Every other waking moment was dedicated to mastering Madame Petrova's challenging, emotionally complex compositions. One evening in late January, Grace was alone in the practice room long after most people had gone home. Snow fell heavily outside the windows as she worked through a particularly difficult passage for the 20th time. A knock at the door startled her. Professor Reed entered, looking tired but determined. "You're still working on the third movement," he observed. "The arpeggios in the development section?" Grace nodded, flexing her fingers. "I can't get the right balance between the melody and accompaniment." Professor Reed placed a paper cup of coffee beside her on the piano. "Drink this, then play it again. I'll listen." She took a grateful sip of the hot liquid. "You didn't have to stay this late." "Neither did you," he pointed out. "Yet here we are." As Grace began to play again, she noticed something different in his demeanor. The usual critical edge was still there, but tempered with genuine interest. When she finished the troublesome passage, he didn't immediately point out the flaws. "What was she like?" Grace asked suddenly. "Madame Petrova, when you knew her." Professor Reed leaned against the wall, considering the question. "Terrifying," he said finally. "Brilliant. Uncompromising. She reduced grown men to tears with her critiques." "But you studied with her anyway." "She accepted only 3 students during the decade I knew her. It was the opportunity of a lifetime." His eyes took on a distant look. "She told me once that great pianists aren't made in comfortable practice rooms or theoretical discussions. They're forged through adversity and obsession." Grace thought of her own journey, the community center piano, the years of sacrifice, the return to music after so long away. "Do you believe that?" "I didn't," he admitted. "I thought technical perfection was enough." He gave her a look she couldn't quite interpret. "I'm beginning to reconsider." In February, a journalist from the city's arts magazine came to interview Grace about the upcoming premiere. The resulting article brought new attention to her unusual story. Soon other media outlets picked up the narrative. The cleaning woman with the hidden musical gift, returning to the stage after 20 years. Director Franklin was delighted with the publicity for Westbrook. Professor Reed was less enthused. "They're reducing you to a human interest story," he complained during a lesson. "A novelty act. Does it matter why people come to the concert?" Grace asked. "Once they're there, the music speaks for itself." He considered this. That's a mature perspective. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered in weeks. As the concert date approached, Grace found herself struggling with unexpected doubts. One evening, she confided in Lily during their now regular coffee meetings. "What if I'm setting myself up for failure?" she whispered. "What if I can't do justice to these compositions?" Lily squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Grace, I've heard you practice. The music lives in you. But the pressure will always be there," Lily finished for her. "For any musician. The question is whether the joy of playing outweighs the fear." Grace thought about this as she walked home through the melting snow. The city was showing the first hints of spring, tiny buds on trees, occasional birdsong in the mornings. At her apartment, she sat at her old, battered upright piano. Its limitations were even more apparent now that she spent her days on concert grands. Yet there was something comforting about its familiar touch. She began to play not Madame Petrova's compositions, not the challenging classical pieces from her lessons, but a simple folk melody her mother used to hum while cooking. As the sweet, uncomplicated tune filled her small living room, Grace finally understood. The path that had led her here, from Pinewood to Riverview to years of cleaning floors to the upcoming concert, wasn't a series of detours and failures. It was her life, with all its complexity and unexpected turns, and every part of it would be present in her performance. May arrived with an explosion of blossoms and sunshine that transformed the city. The concert hall at Riverside Symphony was plastered with posters featuring Grace's face alongside dramatic text. World premiere, The Lost Works of Elena Petrova. Beneath, in smaller letters, performed by Grace Baker, her forgotten protégé. The morning of the performance, Grace woke before dawn. She sat by her apartment window, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the soft pink of sunrise. In just 12 hours, she would step onto the biggest stage of her life, a moment she'd once dreamed of, then mourned as lost forever. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lily. "Today's the day. Breathe, you've got this." Grace smiled, grateful for her friend's support. Over the past months, many people had rallied around her. Lily, Director Franklin, even some of the students she taught. But the most surprising champion had been Professor Reed. As the concert date approached, his demanding nature hadn't softened, but something in their dynamic had shifted. The mocking edge was gone from his criticism. Instead, there was an intensity, almost a desperation in his coaching, as if her success had become personally important to him. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Grace wasn't expecting anyone so early. She opened the door to find Professor Reed standing there impeccably dressed despite the hour, holding a small package. "Professor, is something wrong?" "No," he said awkwardly. "I merely thought you might want to practice on the concert piano before the hall opens to staff. I've arranged access." "That's very thoughtful," Grace said, genuinely touched. "Yes, well." He cleared his throat. "Also, this arrived from Pinewood yesterday." He handed her the package. "Your brother sent it to the academy. I took the liberty of bringing it to you." Grace recognized her younger brother's handwriting on the label. "Thank you." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Professor Reed checked his watch. "The car's waiting downstairs. I'll give you a moment to prepare." "Car?" Grace raised her eyebrows. "I took the liberty of arranging transportation for today." He seemed almost embarrassed by his own thoughtfulness. "You should focus on the music, not public transit schedules." 20 minutes later, they rode in silence through the quiet morning streets. Grace carefully opened the package on her lap. Inside was a faded photograph in a simple frame and a note. The photo showed a teenage girl sitting at a piano, her face alight with joy as her fingers pressed the keys. Behind her stood an elderly woman with kind eyes and a proud smile. Grace recognized herself at 16 with Mrs. Harper, her first real teacher. The note read, "Found this while cleaning out Dad's house. Thought you might want it today. We're all so proud of you, sis. Mom would be too. Love, David." Grace felt tears well up. She hadn't been able to afford tickets for her siblings to come to the concert. They lived too far away, with jobs and children that made travel difficult. But they would be with her in spirit. She showed the photograph to Professor Reed without explanation. He studied it for a long moment. "Your first teacher?" he guessed. Grace nodded. "Mrs. Harper, she gave me lessons for free. Drove me to my Riverview audition." Professor Reed handed the photo back carefully. "She recognized what you had." "One of the few who did," Grace said softly. "I should have," he replied, so quietly she almost missed it. The concert hall was eerily silent as they walked across the empty stage. The Steinway Concert Grand waited at center stage, its lid raised, gleaming under the work lights. "I'll be in the back," Professor Reed said. "Take your time. Feel the space." Left alone, Grace circled the piano slowly. It was larger than any she had played before, built for projecting sound into vast concert halls. She ran her fingers lightly over the fallboard, not yet ready to expose the keys. "We meet again," she whispered to the instrument, as if greeting an old friend after a long separation. Finally, she sat on the bench, adjusting it carefully. She opened the keyboard and placed her fingers on the cool ivory, not pressing down, just feeling the weight and balance of the keys. Then she began to play. She started with simple scales and arpeggios, listening to how the notes carried in the empty hall. Gradually, she moved into passages from Madame Petrova's compositions, testing the piano's response to different touches and dynamics. The instrument was magnificent, responsive to the lightest finger pressure, capable of thunderous fortissimos and whisper-soft pianissimos. As she played, Grace felt a curious sensation of merging with the piano, as if the boundary between musician and instrument was dissolving. Hours passed without her noticing. Occasionally, Professor Reed appeared with water or coffee, then vanished again without disturbing her connection with the music. Around noon, Lily arrived with a sandwich that Grace barely touched. "You should rest," Lily advised. "Save something for tonight." But Grace couldn't stop. The music poured out of her, refining itself with each repetition. This wasn't practice anymore. It was communion. By late afternoon, stagehands and technicians began filtering into the hall. Grace reluctantly ended her session, knowing she needed to conserve energy. Professor Reed appeared at her side. "The dressing room is ready," he said. Ms. Chen brought your concert attire earlier. Grace nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what lay ahead. Professor, she said hesitantly, thank you. For everything. He looked momentarily taken aback by her sincerity. I've merely done my job. No, she said firmly. You've done much more than that. A flicker of emotion crossed his face before he regained his composure. We should continue this conversation after your triumphant performance, Ms. Baker. In the dressing room, Grace found a simple but elegant black gown waiting. Lily had helped her select it, classic enough to honor the seriousness of the premiere, but with subtle details that felt uniquely hers. As she changed and arranged her hair, Grace thought about how far she had come from that night at the Academy Gala. The cleaning woman who had been mocked was now preparing to make her concert debut. Life had a strange way of coming full circle. A soft knock announced Dr. Winters, the symphony director. May I come in? Of course, Grace called, smoothing her dress nervously. Dr. Winters entered, elegant in her own evening wear. I wanted to check on you before the chaos begins. She smiled warmly. The hall is sold out. Press from 3 major music publications, even a critic from the International Piano Review. Grace felt a flutter of panic. No pressure then, Dr. Winters laughed. You'll be magnificent. I've heard your rehearsals. She handed Grace a small velvet box. I thought you might want to wear these tonight. They belong to Elena Petrova. Inside the box lay a pair of simple pearl earrings. Grace looked up in shock. I couldn't possibly. Elena left them to me in her will, Dr. Winters explained. She would want her student wearing them for the premiere of her work. But how did you know I was her student? Grace asked, carefully lifting the earrings. I was at Riverview during your time there, Dr. Winters said. A visiting instructor. I never worked with you directly, but Elena spoke of you often. She was devastated when you left. Grace fastened the pearls, blinking back tears. I had no choice. She knew that eventually, Dr. Winters assured her. And she would be immensely proud of you tonight. As 7 o'clock approached, Grace could hear the hall filling with the murmur of the audience. She peeked through the curtain to see Professor Reed in the front row, uncharacteristically nervous, straightening his program repeatedly. Beside him sat Lily, serene and confident. Director Franklin was there with several Westbrook faculty members. Even Mr. Blackwood, the donor whose challenge had started it all, was present with a large group of friends. At 5 minutes to 8, the hall lights dimmed. Dr. Winters stepped onto the stage to introduce the evening's program and share the remarkable story of Madame Petrova's lost compositions. And now, she concluded, it is my great honor to present a pianist of extraordinary sensitivity and power. Please welcome Grace Baker. The applause washed over Grace as she walked onto the stage. The bright lights blinded her to all but the first few rows. She took a deep breath, centered herself, and bowed to the audience. Then she took her seat at the piano. In the moment before she began to play, time seemed suspended. Her mind flashed through images from her life, her childhood home, Mrs. Harper's encouraging smile, Madame Petrova's demanding presence, the years of cleaning floors at Westbrook, Professor Reed's initial mockery and subsequent mentorship. All of it had led to this moment. She placed her hands on the keys and began the first delicate notes of Petrova's Reflections on Winter. The piece started softly, like snow falling in the darkness, then gradually built in complexity and emotion. The musical representation of a Russian winter landscape. As she played, Grace disappeared into the music. There was no audience, no pressure, no past or future, only the present moment, the notes flowing from her fingers, the emotional narrative of the composition unfolding through her interpretation. The program continued with Summer Memories, a playful, vibrant piece that showcased Petrova's lighter side, and Autumn Leaves with its melancholic beauty and technical challenges. Each piece received increasingly enthusiastic applause. For the finale, Grace performed Spring Awakening, the most demanding of the compositions. As her fingers danced across the keyboard, she felt a profound sense of rightness, as if her entire life, with all its detours and heartbreaks, had been preparation for this moment. The final chord resonated through the hall, hanging in the air for a breathless moment before the audience erupted. People rose to their feet, applauding wildly, some wiping tears from their eyes. Grace stood somewhat dazed by the response. She bowed deeply, acknowledging the audience's appreciation not just for her performance but for Madame Petrova's brilliant, previously unheard music. As the applause continued, Dr. Winters joined her on stage with a bouquet of flowers. Behind her came Professor Reed, looking uncharacteristically emotional. "Brava," he said simply, taking her hand. In that one word, Grace heard everything he couldn't say aloud. His pride in her achievement, his regret for his initial judgment, his respect for her as an artist. The reception afterward passed in a blur of congratulations and praise. Critics approached with thoughtful questions about her interpretation. Music students asked for advice. Dr. Winters introduced her to conductors and music directors interested in future collaborations. Late in the evening, Grace finally found a quiet moment. She stepped onto a small balcony for some fresh air. The city lights sparkled below, and a gentle spring breeze carried the scent of flowering trees. Professor Reed appeared beside her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He offered her one silently. "To Madame Petrova," Grace proposed, raising her glass. "2 second chances," he countered softly. They drank, looking out over the city. "What happens now?" Grace asked eventually. "Now," Professor Reed said, "you have choices. Recording offers, concert opportunities, teaching positions." He turned to face her. "The path you were meant to follow 20 years ago has reopened." Grace considered this. "Not the same path," she said thoughtfully. "A new one. Better maybe because of everything that came between." "How so?" "The girl who went to Riverview had technical skill and raw talent," Grace explained. "But she hadn't lived enough to truly understand the emotions in the music." She smiled. "The woman who played tonight has loved and lost. She's known struggle and sacrifice, disappointment and unexpected joy. She plays differently." Professor Reed nodded slowly. "With authenticity." "Yes." Grace looked back at the reception, visible through the glass doors, the world that was now open to her again. "I don't regret the journey, even the hardest parts." "And I," said Professor Reed quietly, "don't regret the night I mockingly invited a cleaning woman to play the piano." His voice held uncharacteristic humility. "It taught me to look beyond appearances, to listen before judging. Lessons I clearly needed." Grace smiled at him, realizing how far they had both come. "We all have blind spots, Professor." "Thomas," he corrected her. "I think we're well past formalities." Inside, someone called Grace's name. Another interview, another admirer, another opportunity. Before rejoining the celebration, she paused for one last moment of private reflection. The young girl from Pinewood who had taught herself piano on an old community center upright had finally found her way home, to music, to recognition, to the place she was meant to be, not despite the detours, but because of them, and that perhaps was the most beautiful revelation of all.